She leaned close, whispered, "Don't tell anyone," and just like that, my world shifted. The first day I noticed her properly, I realized how ordinary classrooms could suddenly feel charged with quiet intensity. I was 24, slightly awkward, and eager to impress in her evening literature class. She was my teacher, a woman in her early 40s, 42, I later learned, with an effortless grace that seemed to fill the room without her even trying. There was nothing ostentatious about her appearance, yet she drew attention naturally. The way her hair fell softly over her shoulders, catching the warm classroom light. The way her hands moved fluidly as she gestured during explanations. The quiet confidence in her posture. I remember the precise moment I felt the spark. She leaned over my desk to point at a margin note I had made in my notebook. Her hand brushed mine lightly, just a fleeting contact. But the warmth lingered, a subtle current of electricity I wasn't expecting. My pulse quickened, though I immediately chastised myself. She was my teacher, older, experienced, and yet, the brief touch carried a weight of understated intimacy that was impossible to ignore. Her voice, calm and measured, resonated differently when she spoke directly to me. There was a softness there, almost teasing, that seemed meant only for me. I found myself listening more intently, absorbing not just her words, but the subtle cadence of her speech, the faintest inflection that hinted at humor or quiet curiosity. Even her scent, a subtle mix of floral and something indefinably warm, left an impression that stayed long after the class ended. It wasn't just physicality. There was something in her presence that made me acutely aware of myself, the way I fidgeted with my pen, the nervous twinge in my stomach whenever she glanced my way. I caught myself noticing details I hadn't before, the curve of her smile when she praised the correct answer, the tiny crease by her eye when she laughed quietly, the way she adjusted her scarf just so, almost unconsciously. I began to anticipate her proximity with a mix of excitement and hesitation. Even the sound of her heels on the linoleum before class made my chest tighten, a reminder that something inside me was stirring, curiosity, admiration, and something I didn't yet have words for. I respected her immensely, but I also felt an unspoken pull, a gentle gravity that seemed to draw us into shared moments, fleeting touches, exchanged glances, and the silent acknowledgement that these interactions meant more than mere student-teacher instruction. By the end of that first week, I realized that my awareness of her was no longer casual. It was attentive, emotional, and quietly charged. I couldn't decide if it was the thrill of learning from her, the subtle intimacy of accidental touches, or simply the human fascination with someone older and assured. Whatever it was, the spark had been lit, and I knew, deep in my chest, that this connection, fleeting, secret, and unspoken, would grow, shaping the days ahead in ways I could not yet imagine. The days after that first spark passed in a blur of anticipation. Each time I entered the classroom, I found myself scanning for her presence, for the subtle movements that revealed her attention, for the rare smiles that seemed to land directly on me. I had expected a student-teacher relationship to be strictly formal, but she had a way of breaking that mold gently, without words, without overt gestures. One evening, after the main lesson had ended and most students had left, she lingered behind to help me with a particularly tricky passage in the text. The classroom was quiet except for the hum of the overhead lights, the soft scratching of our pens, and the occasional rustle of papers. As she leaned over the desk, I caught a faint hint of her perfume, delicate and warm, almost like sunlit jasmine, lingering in the air around her. Her shoulder brushed mine briefly, a casual touch, yet it made my chest tighten in a way that surprised me. We walked together down the hallway, discussing the subtleties of a metaphor in the text. Her voice was low and calm, yet it carried a subtle playful undertone that seemed meant only for me. I noticed how the light from the corridor windows caught her hair, giving it a warm, almost golden glow. I was hyper-aware of the space between us, the rhythm of her steps, the quiet cadence of her breathing. It was as if each small detail, the gentle sway of her scarf, the way her fingers curled around her pen, the tilt of her head when she laughed, was magnified, and I couldn't look away. During our discussion, she placed her hand briefly over mine to guide me to the correct line in my notebook. The contact was fleeting, but the warmth of her skin, the subtle pressure of her palm, lingered in my mind long after she had withdrawn her hand. I could feel a strange mixture of reassurance and electricity in that small gesture, a silent communication that seemed intimate and private. As we spoke, I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't expected. I shared a minor worry about my writing, and she responded with a quiet story from her own life, something simple yet deeply human, a moment of vulnerability that revealed her warmth beneath the composed exterior. Her eyes held a softness that invited trust, and for the first time, I felt that the age gap, which I had considered a boundary, was less a wall and more a gentle space where understanding could flourish. When we finally returned to our desks, the room felt different, charged with a quiet sense of connection. Her smile lingered in my memory, subtle but meaningful, as if acknowledging our shared understanding. Every small interaction, a brush of hands, a shared laugh, the attentive tilt of her head, added to a growing tapestry of closeness that was both thrilling and disconcerting. By the end of the evening, I realized that the quiet moments we shared mattered far more than the formal lessons. I wasn't just learning about literature. I was learning about the nuances of human connection, about how intimacy could exist in the smallest gestures, and about the magnetic pull of someone who was at once confident, graceful, and quietly vulnerable. I left the classroom with a strange mixture of anticipation and trepidation, knowing that the bond forming between us was delicate, yet impossible to ignore. The classroom felt unusually quiet that evening, the hum of the fluorescent lights soft against the background of scattered papers and empty chairs. Most students had already left, leaving just the two of us bent over a project that required careful attention. I was aware of every sound, the faint scratch of her pen against the paper, the subtle creak of her chair as she shifted closer, the soft rhythm of her breathing, almost imperceptible yet intimate in the hush of the room. She leaned over my notebook to point at a line I had misread, and her shoulder brushed mine lightly. The touch was brief, accidental, or so I told myself, but the warmth it carried lingered far longer than expected. My pulse quickened in a way that startled me, and I realized I was holding my breath, conscious of every fraction of space between us. Her proximity was intoxicating, though entirely innocent, the softness of her hair brushing against my arm, the gentle slope of her hand resting briefly on the desk next to mine, and the quiet steadiness of her presence made it impossible not to notice her. I caught her glance out of the corner of my eye, and for a moment, it felt as though time had slowed. She was smiling, not openly, but with that subtle, knowing lift of her lips that hinted at private amusement. It was playful yet unspoken, a tension that didn't need words to exist. My mind raced with the question, was this just a teacher being kind, or was there something more, something quietly intimate in the way she moved around me? Suddenly, there was a knock at the classroom door, and she stepped back slightly, brushing past me. Her hand lightly grazed my arm, a fleeting contact that sent an unexpected shiver through me. I caught a faint scent of her perfume, delicate and floral, and it seemed to settle into my senses, embedding itself in the memory of that brief, stolen moment. I looked up to meet her eyes, and for a heartbeat, there was a shared acknowledgement, a silent, private connection that existed only between us. I struggled internally. Every instinct told me to maintain distance, to respect the boundaries imposed by our age gap and her role as my teacher. And yet I couldn't ignore the thrill, the subtle desire to be near her, to feel the comfort of her presence even in this charged, accidental intimacy. Her calm demeanor contrasted with the rush of emotions I felt, making me painfully aware of the quiet longing building inside me. She leaned in again, this time to whisper a small clarification about the project, her voice brushing against my ear. It was so soft that I barely heard the words, but the closeness, the warmth, and the private nature of the sound left a lasting impression. I felt my cheeks flush, my heart pounding, yet I also felt an odd sense of reassurance, that this fleeting, innocent moment of proximity, though laden with tension, was safe, cherished, and meaningful. By the time the project was complete, I was acutely aware that something had shifted. The accidental touches, the close proximity, and the soft, shared laughter had created a bond neither of us had explicitly acknowledged but both of us felt. I left the classroom that night with a head full of thoughts and a chest tight with unspoken feelings, realizing that this slow, delicate tension between us was only beginning to unfold. It was a late afternoon when it happened, the kind of light that slants through the classroom windows in golden streams, making ordinary objects look softer, more intimate. The day had been long, and most of the students had already filed out, leaving the room hushed except for the faint rustle of papers and the distant hum of traffic outside. I was reviewing my notes when she appeared beside me, leaning over my desk with a closeness that made my chest tighten instantly. Her presence was warm, grounding, yet electric in its subtlety. As she pointed out a correction in my notebook, her hair brushed my shoulder, and the faint, familiar scent of her perfume enveloped me. I felt my pulse quicken at the gentle, seemingly accidental contact. Then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned in closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth of her breath as she spoke. "Don't tell anyone about this," she whispered, her voice low, intimate, brushing against my ear. It wasn't a command, but a secret shared, a private bubble where only the two of us existed for a brief moment. Her words were accompanied by the faintest smile, one of those smiles that felt like it held a universe of unspoken understanding. The warmth of her body close to mine, the slight brush of her hand against the edge of my notebook, and the softness of her hair grazing my cheek created an intimacy that was entirely emotional, yet charged with quiet, unspoken tension. I was acutely aware of every detail. The light catching the subtle highlights in her hair, the gentle curve of her cheek, the softness of her lips as she spoke. My fingers tightened around my pen, as if grounding myself against the surge of emotion she had unknowingly invoked. In that whisper, there was trust, playfulness, and an unspoken acknowledgement of the bond that had been quietly forming between us over weeks of fleeting glances, shared laughter, and accidental touches. Her eyes met mine briefly, holding a warmth that made it impossible to look away. There was a flicker of mischief, but beneath it, a profound gentleness, an understanding of the fragile emotional space she had stepped into with me. I felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and restraint, knowing that this moment was fleeting, secret, and sacred. Every fiber of my being was alert, the warmth of her arm near mine, the faint brush of her fingers against the desk, the quiet cadence of her breathing. It all lingered in a delicate, almost tangible way. Even after she straightened and returned to her own desk, the whisper remained in my mind, a tender echo that I carried long after the classroom emptied. My heart raced, my thoughts tangled between admiration, desire, and a careful awareness of boundaries. That single whispered phrase, paired with her knowing smile and subtle touch, marked a turning point. It was the first moment where the slow, simmering tension between us crystallized into something unmistakably real, a private, shared secret that would bind us in ways words could scarcely capture. As I packed my notebook and left the room, I felt both elation and a quiet trepidation. That whisper had shifted everything. What had once been casual admiration had deepened into an awareness of connection, intimacy, and unspoken longing, a connection neither of us would speak aloud, yet one that pulsed quietly in the spaces between our glances, touches, and smiles. The days following her whispered secret were strangely heavy with thought. Each class felt longer, each glance toward her fraught with awareness, as though my mind was suddenly tuned to every detail of her presence. I found myself analyzing moments that had once seemed ordinary, the tilt of her head when she explained a concept, the subtle curve of her smile when she noticed my attentiveness, even the rhythmic tap of her pen against the desk. Every movement was amplified, every gesture charged with significance I wasn't sure I should acknowledge. I began avoiding her slightly, or at least trying to. Not out of disinterest, but out of caution. I didn't want to misread her intentions or overstep boundaries. Yet, every attempt to create distance only heightened my awareness of her proximity. When she moved past my desk, her hand would occasionally brush mine or my shoulder, light touches that lingered in memory far longer than their brief duration. It was impossible not to notice the warmth of her skin, the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, or the soft curve of her lips when she smiled, knowing or perhaps sensing the effect she had on me. Her subtle attentions became a puzzle I could not stop trying to solve. She would offer casual guidance, leaning close to explain a point, her breath warm against my ear, her hair brushing my shoulder. She never lingered inappropriately, never crossed clear boundaries, but each interaction carried a quiet intimacy. It left me both exhilarated and cautious, a mix of longing and respect that I didn't fully understand. I was aware of the age gap. She was in her early 40s, confident, graceful, and experienced, and yet her attention made me feel seen in a way that was entirely new, entirely personal. In moments alone, I reflected on my feelings. Admiration, fascination, and a quiet yearning tangled together in my mind. I questioned myself constantly. Was it appropriate to feel this way? Was I reading too much into gestures meant as kindness? And yet, the emotions persisted, refusing to be dismissed. I realized that my attraction was not purely physical. It was the depth of her character, the warmth beneath her confidence, the subtle vulnerability glimpsed in fleeting anecdotes, and the understated way she seemed to recognize and honor my sincerity. She, too, seemed aware of the delicate tension. Her casual teases, the faint sparkle in her eyes, and the way she drew slightly closer during explanations all suggested a gentle encouragement, a way of bridging the emotional space between us without breaking the rules that governed our roles. I began to understand that her attentions were not careless. They were intentional, a quiet invitation to connect without words, to share a space where vulnerability and trust could coexist with respect. By the end of the week, the conflict within me had become more defined. I was drawn to her in ways I hadn't anticipated, yet I also respected the boundaries we shared. Each class, each brief touch, and each quiet smile added layers to the complex, simmering connection that had formed between us. I was caught between admiration and desire, hesitation and longing, fully aware that this slow, careful dance was only just beginning, and that every glance, every brush of hands, and every whispered word carried meaning far beyond what either of us could openly admit. It was one of those evenings when the sky glowed in soft shades of amber and rose, the kind of light that makes the world feel slower, more intimate. After class had ended, she suggested walking with me to the nearby cafe to continue discussing a passage from the day's lesson. I hesitated at first, aware of the lingering tension and the unspoken rules between us, but her warm, inviting smile made the decision feel natural rather than transgressive. As we walked side by side, the rhythm of our steps matched in an almost imperceptible way. The faint warmth of her shoulder brushed mine occasionally, light, fleeting touches that left a trace of electricity. Her laughter, soft and melodic, punctuated our conversation, and I noticed the subtle sparkle in her eyes when she smiled at something I said. It was a playful warmth, a quiet acknowledgement of our growing connection, yet entirely gentle, entirely appropriate. We paused at a quiet corner of the street, where the late sunlight slanted through the trees, casting patterned shadows across the pavement. She gestured toward a small, inviting cafe nearby. As we sat at a corner table, I became acutely aware of the space between us. The table was small, but not so small as to force closeness, yet every time she leaned forward to point something out in my notebook, our proximity sent a thrill through me. Her hand brushed against mine, almost casually, as she adjusted my papers. The warmth lingered in a way that made me acutely conscious of her presence, and I felt a curious blend of comfort and anticipation. The conversation flowed effortlessly. We shared laughter over a misread line in the text, and I found myself drawn not just to her intellect, but to the way she listened, fully, attentively, with an openness that made me feel seen in ways I hadn't experienced before. There was a quiet intimacy in the way she rested her hand near mine on the table, not forcing contact, but allowing it to exist naturally. The simple touch carried weight, a grounding presence that made the world outside fade into soft background noise. At one point she tilted her head slightly, her fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face, and I realized I was studying her more closely than I should. The lines of experience around her eyes, the soft curve of her lips, the subtle strength in her posture, all of it spoke of someone confident, yet quietly vulnerable, someone who could hold a space of trust and warmth effortlessly. I felt a connection not defined by age or circumstance, but by mutual attention, by the small gestures that carried far more meaning than words could express. When it was time to leave, she rested her hand lightly on my upper back as we stepped outside. The contact was fleeting, yet comforting, an affirmation of the bond we had quietly nurtured. I walked away with my heart full, aware that this shared moment, laughter, touch, and attentive presence, had deepened our connection in a way that was tender, meaningful, and entirely real. I realized that intimacy was not measured by dramatic gestures, but by the quiet closeness of shared experiences, the lingering warmth of gentle touches, and the unspoken understanding that grows between two people who truly see each other. The final day of our short course arrived, bringing a quiet bittersweetness that neither of us spoke aloud. The classroom felt different that morning, familiar, yet charged with the unspoken weight of everything that had passed between us. Each glance, each small gesture, each whispered moment lingered in my mind, replaying in vivid detail as though the walls themselves remembered our closeness. She approached me after the lesson, her usual composed demeanor softened by a subtle warmth. Her smile, quiet and knowing, seemed to acknowledge the bond we had quietly nurtured. "You've done very well," she said, her voice gentle, almost playful, and I felt my chest tighten at the simplicity of the praise. It carried layers of meaning, a recognition not just of effort, but of connection, attention, and shared moments over weeks. As the room emptied around us, she lingered, and I felt an awareness of proximity, a soft gravity pulling me closer without words. We exchanged a conversation about the final assignment, but it was punctuated by laughter and shared glances that carried far more meaning than the mundane discussion. I noticed how her hand brushed mine when she reached for a book, the subtle warmth of her touch leaving an echo in my chest. Every detail, the light glinting off her hair, the quiet rhythm of her voice, the gentle slope of her shoulder as she leaned toward me, felt heightened, intimate, and deeply grounding. When it was time to part, she stepped closer, and the moment felt suspended in time. She placed a hand lightly on my upper back as a gesture of farewell, her fingers warm and steady. Her cheek brushed my shoulder briefly, a delicate, tender contact that was more meaningful than words. I felt the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat through the subtle proximity, a grounding presence that left me simultaneously elated and serene. The simplicity of the gesture, so fleeting yet so charged with emotional resonance, captured everything our slow-burn connection had become: trust, tenderness, and unspoken understanding. Her eyes met mine, holding a depth of emotion that words could not capture. There was acknowledgement, warmth, and a quiet fondness, all communicated in a glance. I realized then that what we shared did not need a dramatic declaration. It was in the small, consistent moments of attention, care, and quiet intimacy, in the lingering touches, the shared laughter, the whispered secrets, and the attentive listening. As I walked away from the classroom, I felt a strange mixture of longing and peace. The story of our connection had reached its gentle culmination, leaving me with the knowledge that the bond we had formed was profound, meaningful, and enduring. Each glance, each touch, each whispered word remained with me, a reminder that intimacy and affection could exist in ways subtle, respectful, and entirely human. By the time I stepped out into the soft light of the afternoon, I carried with me the warmth of her presence, the memory of her smile, and the quiet joy of having shared something rare, a connection that transcended age, circumstance, and expectation, leaving a lasting imprint on my heart. It was a gentle, tender ending, one that left me full, content, and quietly hopeful for the future, whatever it might bring.